thank you so much for being here. I want to start with these 5 forces that you see right now that are affecting markets that are important to understand in order to understand where we are. Could you just talk a little bit about what those forces are?
Sure. Through history and now, there are 5 big forces that are interrelated and generally transpire in cycles as I described. And we know they exist because everything that we are going to talk about will fall into one of those categories. That is the debt money economy cycle, meaning credit is buying power. You give buying power to entities like, it's like the circulatory system. You give credit, and if that credit produces, it'll produce debt. But if it produces an income that is good enough to pay the debt, it's a healthy system. But when it produces more debt and more debt service payments, that squeezes out the spending, and that produces a problem, and then there's a supply-demand problem that has to, and then there are economic problems. Okay, that's one cycle. The second cycle related to that, because money and wealth have political and social effects, is that there becomes big differences in wealth and values. And so when there are big differences in wealth and values, and the people feel that the system isn't working for them, you see greater political polarity between the left and the right. It becomes more the hard left and the hard right. And those become irreconcilable differences that are not easily solved through the usual means of operating that way, such as democracies. During the 30s, for example, 4 major democracies chose to be autocracies during those periods. The third is the international geopolitical cycle. In other words, of a rising power challenging existing powers, and the same dominance of the dominant power fades relative to other powers, and also the order then gets challenged, and we're certainly going through that. The fourth factor throughout history has been acts of nature. Droughts, floods, and pandemics have actually killed more people than wars, and actually led to more ends of the previously mentioned cycles than anything else. So nature, and certainly nature, climate change and the like, is a big force. And then fifth, through history, are man's learnings of particularly developments of new technologies. The developments of new technologies is what has raised living standards over time, which you can see in terms of life expectancies and per capita GDP. And of course, the development of new technologies now is a very important influence. So those 5 factors have evolved. Those are the main 5 factors. Anything we'll talk about will be under one of those. And of course, the interrelationships between them is important.
It seems like we're at the cross-section of a pretty transformative moment then, because it's this cross-section of all of these things, whether it's the AI aspect, the technological overlay, the monetary debt aspect of it with respect to the debt and deficit. Can you put into perspective the fact that this has been building up over time? Where do the tariffs and some of the trade disputes of today fit into that? Do they help sort of alleviate some of these imbalances? Do they exacerbate them? Are they a symptom of them? How do you understand sort of that aspect of policy right now? Well,
first of all, there are great imbalances that have to be rectified given this set of circumstances. 3 major types, which relate to trade, but they also relate to capital. The first is that the dynamic by which Chinese export to the United States items that are cost-effective and Americans buy them, and then they send the money back, and the Chinese earn the money and take that money and invest in bonds, has created a unsustainable dynamic, because as we're living in this environment related to the next 2 items, where those 2 countries can be in conflict, military conflict, there necessarily has to be insecurities on both parties, the Chinese having an insecurity of whether they're actually going to be able to turn their credit into goods and services. In other words, there's no purpose of holding a bond or an asset unless you can then sell it and get money and buy things. And when that dynamic works the other way, it's quite painful for the debtor to have to pay back in real stuff. And then in a geopolitical conflict, that's a problem. And then, of course, and then in this environment of conflict, that's also the problem of, it's worsened. Because in wars in prior times, or even with Russia, then there were freezing of assets, and there could always be that kind of issue. So that's a consideration. And then, of course, there's the loss of manufacturing. And the loss of manufacturing in the United States, has two problems, which are that it's connected to self-sustaining. You have to be able to be in a risky world. You have to be able to produce what you need. So you need to be capable in manufacturing certain items. And then also the wealth, the loss of the middle class has a lot to do with the loss of manufacturing. So for those reasons, that imbalance, that let's call it trade and capital count imbalance, it's both a trade issue and a capital issue. And raising tariffs is a way of dealing with that. Through history, tariffs really have been more of a tax than other forms of taxes, going way back, and they bring in tax revenue. So, they'll probably bring in somewhere between 300 million and 500 million a year, something like that. And so that's a consideration. So that's the mechanics about what's happening.
I just wonder if you think that that goes toward alleviating concerns about debt insustainability, certainly in the United States, given that there will be those revenues.
Yeah, right. It is a source of revenue, and it will diminish that. However, the economics, it's small by comparison to the gap. So, as I said, the mechanics of the debt situation are really have a few components. The first is that when debt service payments add up, they squeeze out other spending. And so that can create the equivalent of an economic heart attack. The second is there's a supply-demand issue. In other words, a deficit requires debt sale. And so we have a lot of debt sales, and there's lessening demand for that. And then there are the central bank playing a role. So what we have now is, think of it as a big company or an individual, except the main difference between a country, and an individual or a company and a government is that the government can print money. So that's the basics. But figure it this way. The United States, here are the numbers. The United States will this year spend about $7 trillion, and it'll take in about $5 trillion. So that means it's spending 40% more than it is taking in. Because it has run deficits and sold a lot of debt, the total debt is about 6 times the total amount of money coming in. And we're seeing those debt service payments squeeze that out. And as a result of what the projections are, it's likely that those deficits will then produce lots of bond sales, which will compound it. When you get into the point in the cycle where debt is needed to pay debt and compounds, it becomes a problem. It becomes a problem also for the central banks, because the central banks, by the way, this is not just an American problem, this is a world problem. The central banks themselves own the debt. And so, and they lose money on the debt. And so when they're losing money on the debt, and they have asset liability problems, then they also not only have to monetize essentially the government's debt, but they also have to monetize theirs. And those are the characteristics that produce a deterioration in the monetary order. And that's why what you're seeing. You're seeing a dynamic of why countries, for example, are letting their reserves or their assets in bonds and so on go down, and they're acquiring and have been acquiring gold, for example. So gold is a currency. You know, we think of currencies as being the major fiat currency, but gold is a currency. It's the second largest reserve currency. And so you're seeing changes in the monetary order that are reflecting those things, somewhat like happened in the early 70s.
Ken Griffin yesterday of Citadel said that he sees gold as more of a safe haven right now than the dollar. Do you agree?
Oh, certainly.